Hello and welcome to this Defence Priorities event, rather provocatively titled NATO or Neutrality. But we're here today in the run-up to NATO's Vilnius summit to talk about a particularly important topic. Will Ukraine be offered membership in NATO at this summit or sometime in the future? Will it be offered some alternative? And this question plays into much bigger, longer running discussions about the future of European security. What will Europe's security architecture look like after the war in Ukraine? What will Ukraine's role in European security be? And how does ending this war, whether or not it ends in the near future, how does that fit into these debates? So I'm really glad to be here today to be able to moderate a panel with experts from a variety of viewpoints on this. I'm Emma Ashford. I am a fellow at the Stimson Center, and I'm pleased to welcome three excellent panelists. So first we have Ben Friedman, my former colleague and the policy director at Defence Priorities. He previously worked as a defence analyst at the Cato Institute and a researcher at the Centre for Defence Information. Next up, we have Lyanna Fix, who's a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations, a historian and political scientist with expertise in German and European security policy, Russia, and more. She's the author of a variety of articles, including a recent excellent series in Foreign Affairs with Michael Kimmage on the ways in which the war might end, and as well as work on European security guarantees. Last but not least, we have Stephen Pifer, who is the former US ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000. He's currently an affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford, better known to most of us as CISAC, and he's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So thank you to you all for being here, and I'm going to give you each a few minutes to sort of give us a little opening remarks. And I think that the big questions that we have on the table, and then hopefully we'll branch out, are the question of whether the United States should provide some kind of security guarantee to Ukraine. And if so, what would the costs be of doing that? What would the benefits be of doing that? So let me turn to Ben first, and then I'll turn to Lyanna and to Stephen.
Thanks, Emma. I've just completed more or less a paper that should be out imminently on this for defense priorities. So I'm gonna speak to that a bit. The argument that I make there, that I'll make quickly here, is that the United States should not guarantee Ukraine's security, period. That we shouldn't do so now via NATO or otherwise, some sort of bilateral security guarantees, and that we shouldn't do so as part of a peace deal. And by security guarantees, what I mean is a promise to defend Ukraine using military force. So if we're just arming them, that doesn't count. And as I'll get to, I think that just arming them, what some people like Emma call the Israel option, is a pretty good idea. We call it armed neutrality. So what I think is likely, by the way, is that Ukraine might receive from the United States some sort of what I will provocatively call fake security guarantees, which is that we'll say we're giving them a security guarantee and we won't mean it. And I think that that might wind up being the worst of all worlds. So I'm going to make, there are basically three arguments that go to this end. The first is that guaranteeing Ukraine's security would erode U.S. security by increasing the risk, obviously, of war with Russia. That's the point of guaranteeing their security, and that contains the risk, of course, of nuclear escalation. And for that risk, I think the United States would receive basically nothing of security value. I can't go into long arguments about this, but the arguments is generally that we need to defend Ukraine because either Russia will use it, if we don't, as a launching pad to expand further into Europe, or because they would, by getting away with attacking Ukraine, would violate the norm of territorial integrity. And what I argue in the paper is that, first of all, Russia is not going to be able to launch any further attacks into Europe because of the hardship that it's seen in Ukraine. But there are further reasons to think that it was never going to be much of an advantage for Russia in terms of further attacks. Basically, Ukraine's just not important enough strategically for that to aid further attacks. And as far as the norm of territorial integrity goes, if we're fighting for that, I think basically we should have a parade, because Russia's experience in Ukraine has been so rough that no one would look at them as an example to emulate. Even if they wind up with some Ukrainian territory that they didn't hold at the beginning of the war, what really matters for the norm of territorial integrity is, does this look like something other people would repeat or should repeat? And I think the answer is a very strong no. The second big reason I think it would be a bad idea for the United States to offer security guarantees, whether it's NATO or something else, to Ukraine, is that they won't be credible. In the Cold War, strategic analysts, people at Rand and Thomas Schelling and so forth, spent a lot of time thinking about how could we make our commitments to relatively important European states like Germany credible when it possibly means mass suicide in an era of mutually assured destruction. And I think that was difficult then, and it's basically impossible now with Ukraine. We've proven that in this war, that we won't take the risks that it will take, that we won't intervene directly for Ukraine. And I think that just putting them in NATO actually won't change our calculus there because of that risk of mass destruction. So I think that it just won't be credible that the United States will actually defend Ukraine, even if we say we are. And we might actually wind up reminding everyone, certainly including Russia, that some of our other security guarantees, for example, the Baltic states, are similarly dubious. The third big reason that we shouldn't defend Ukraine, in a way, follows from the second, or offer security guarantees to Ukraine, is that it might actually be bad for Ukraine. Of course, it will give pause to Russia if we guarantee Ukraine security and the threat of nukes hangs over everything. But I think ultimately they won't find it credible, so it's likely not to stop them, and will be preserving a cause of the war by offering security guarantees. So to the extent the war is still going, it will make it harder to end if we're saying we're going to put them in NATO or something like that after. And if the war has ended and we give them security guarantees, it makes it more likely to restart. And then finally, I think it might be bad for Ukraine because they might think it's real. They might, I think, something similar happened, I think, before the war, in the run up to it, where they thought maybe they had more support from the U.S. than they did, and made decisions that they wouldn't have made if they realized that we weren't actually going to fight for them, certainly at any point. So I think by offering them what are essentially fraudulent security guarantees, we might encourage them to make bad decisions. So I think I've spoken enough here, but I think that the option of armed neutrality, where we continue to arm them, hopefully with a lot of help from the Europeans, which Emma has just written a paper on, by the way, is a much better one that I think could work and actually will be credible, unlike offering them security guarantees to fight for them. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. Let's turn it over to Lyanna, not just as an expert, but also to give us a European perspective on these discussions that are often dominated by Americans.
Thanks so much, Emma. I would try to make three arguments why the Israel model that we have just alluded to, the kind of security pact, that's another word for basically saying the Ukrainian army is the best security guarantee Ukraine has, and we just have to arm it for a long time. Why this kind of Israel model alone is not sufficient, because it will not answer the final question of where is Ukraine's place in Europe. It will keep Ukraine in a gray zone scenario. But there's also a false dichotomy in arguing that the only alternative we have to the Israel model or to the kind of security pact model is NATO membership for Ukraine now. If we put it into these two alternatives, obviously everyone would argue, well, NATO membership for Ukraine now is too dangerous, because the lines that one could take as NATO lines for a Ukraine member are too dynamic. The fighting is going on, so it will most probably lead to a NATO-Russia escalation. So if not NATO membership now, but if the Israel model is not enough as a security pact, what would be the alternative? And the alternative is to combine the Israel model, the security pact, for the short term with a long-term NATO perspective for Ukraine, which means to give Ukraine at the Vilnius summit or at any other point close in the future, not far away in the future, a perspective that they will become NATO member after the fighting stops and after the war ends. Why is this combination of these two models necessary? Why is Israel alone not enough? And there are three reasons for that. And it's not only a generosity towards Ukraine, it's not only a concern about Ukraine, it's in our own fundamental security interest. If we think about having, as Europe, an Israel model in our neighborhood, it would certainly be a different Israel model. Ukraine has no nuclear weapons. It is a risk factor. What we have seen in the past is that EU and NATO enlargement has been the most successful instrument that the United States and the rest of Europe have applied to stabilize the European continent. And if Europe and the United States have the alternative to have an Israel next to Europe, or to have a country like Poland next to Europe, which is safe, which is prosperous, and which is not under constant risk of attack, under constant risk of conflict spilling over, I think the question should be pretty clear. It would be better to have a Poland next to Europe's borders than to have an Israel model with a constant risk of the war and of attacks spilling over to Europe model, because Ukraine would be left to defend itself, basically, with Western help. The second argument is that only the Israel model will not deter Vladimir Putin. It will also not deter his successors to stop trying to attack Ukraine. If we don't give Ukraine a NATO perspective for after the fighting ends, Putin and any successor will feel that the case is not closed, that Ukraine is still in a gray zone, and that it is worth trying, even if Vladimir Putin fails this time, that it is worth trying again and trying to turn back Ukraine. So the case will never be closed. It will always be a temptation for Russia to try again in the next years, possibly throughout the next decades. And the third point is obviously that if this becomes the case, we have the best recipe for exactly what we want to prevent, and what is something that US policymakers are also concerned about, a forever war. Because this kind of open flank, this vulnerability in Europe will always remain there. Of course, we don't know right now what will happen after the fighting ends, what kind of armistice we will have, what kind of victory of Ukraine we will have. And that is why a NATO perspective cannot be concrete enough in terms of saying Ukraine will be a NATO member in 3 or 4 or 5 years. But it has to be more concrete than just the Bucharest promise of 2008, which basically said, well, Ukraine will become a NATO member at some point in the future, which never turned out to be true. So we need to give a more concrete perspective, and it is also necessary right now during the counteroffensive to reduce the optimism in Moscow that they just have to wait until the counteroffensive is over. They just have to wait until Europe gets tired, that they just have to wait until US elections in 2024. And this optimism will not go away simply through the Israel model. Of course, the Israel model would include, and it's important to have long and formalized support structures for Ukraine, but it would not, what we would call in the European Union context, it would not answer the question of finality, of where does Ukraine belong to. And therefore, again, it would leave Ukraine for a long time vulnerable. And I think this point is especially given where we see negotiations now with regard to the NATO Vilnius summit. This point is especially important given that it is Germany and the United States that are at the moment the countries that are most opposed towards a NATO membership perspective after the war. It is the lessons of history that both Germany and the United States had in Europe. Germany in 1955 becoming a NATO member, and the United States pushing forward EU and NATO enlargement after the end of the Cold War, that this kind of model is the model that gives us stability. And it also does not help if we say, well, we will discuss this in the future. Let Ukraine first end the war, because in the future, the kind of urgency that the political leaders have right now will be gone. So you need, in a time of historical change, you need to take this opportunity, and one needs to advance the envelope and to push the envelope as far ahead as possible, because otherwise, in a couple of years, we might not have the same political will, and we might not have the same opportunity to shape European security as we have now. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Steve, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. I'm glad to be here with Ben and Lyanna. Let me just give a short preview. I come down, I think, a lot closer to Lyanna. But I want to go back and start with sort of basic principles, and that is the United States has, for more than 7 decades, defined a vital national interest in a stable and secure Europe. I mean, that's why we were establishing NATO back in 1949. And I think it's now become pretty clear that there is going to be no stable and secure Europe unless there's a secure Ukraine. So when I look at security guarantees for Ukraine, it sees ultimately Ukraine's best security guarantee is membership in NATO as well as in the European Union. Now, a Ukraine in NATO will concern Russia. And I think over the last 15 years, there has been some deference to that Russian concern about Ukraine in NATO. However, I also would argue that Russia has, by virtue of this brutal and unprovoked war, forfeited any claim that it has to deference to its position on this question. Ukraine has met most of the criteria that the alliance asks of aspirants. Moreover, it has shown it has serious military capability. Indeed, Ukraine has one of the strongest military forces now in Europe. But I think Ukraine does not have a possibility in the near term of getting membership in NATO, because that would require all NATO members, all 31 countries now, hopefully 32, basically to be prepared to go to war against Russia on Ukraine's behalf. That's not going to be possible, particularly while the war is going on. But I do hope that the summit in Vilnius next week will do some things, lay out a roadmap that puts Ukraine on the path towards membership, as well as coming up with ways to tighten NATO-Ukraine relations in a way that could ultimately serve the purposes of deterrence and defense, not just for the alliance, but for Ukraine. Until you get to that NATO membership, you're going to have a bridge, and it will come up with a lot of the ideas that have already been discussed. Commitments by Western powers, the United States, Britain, Germany, and France at the lead, to provide weapons and Ukraine so that Ukraine can build a modern military after there is a settlement. And I do believe at some point that there's going to be a negotiation between Russia and Ukraine on this. What I can't tell you is when that's going to happen. But after that, it'll be important that Ukraine has a robust modern military that could deter a Russian attack in the future. That will require provision of weapons, including main battle tanks, F-16s. It'll include training, it'll exercise intelligence support. And also there should be a commitment from the West as to what the West would provide Ukraine in the event of a new aggression, a new attack by the Russians. The United States, the European Union, and G7, I think, should commit that they will maintain an ability to sanction Russia. My guess is that if there's a settlement, at least some of the sanctions might be lifted, although I would argue there are good reasons to retain some sanctions, particularly those that limit Western goods that go into Russian military production. But at a minimum, the G7 and the European Union will need to maintain a mechanism to reimpose sanctions in the event that Russia engages in new aggression. Now, just briefly on the benefits and the costs, it seems to me that the benefit of providing the security guarantees, ultimately including NATO membership for Ukraine, is that a secure Ukraine promotes a stable and secure Europe. That goes back to the first principle of a U.S. vital interest. But moreover, it seems to me that not only does a secure Ukraine deter Russia from further attacks, but it would also discourage the Kremlin from other aggressive actions. And here I pay attention to the words of Vladimir Putin when he talks about his interest in recovering what he calls historic Russian lands. Well, if one looks at a map of the Russian Empire in the late 19th century, it's not just most of modern Ukraine, but a good chunk of Poland, the 3 Baltic states, and Finland were all part of historic Russian lands under Putin's definition. Now, let me say, I think it's a very small probability that the Russians might take military action against Finland, the Baltic states, or Poland, now that they're all NATO members. But I would be hesitant to say that it's a 0 probability. And I think actually it's one that merits significant concern and attention by NATO. And I would just, for point of comparison, saying, had we been having this conversation 3 or 4 years ago, I think we would all said 0 probability or very small probability of Russia launching the kind of invasion that Russia launched in February of last year against Ukraine, yet it happened. So I think there are benefits. The costs are going to be arming Ukraine to deter Russia in the future. Will not be cheap, but it will be worthwhile. And of course, U.S. continued support Ukraine is going to continue to be a very sore point with Russia. That's unfortunate, but it can't be helped. We're going to need that until there's some change in policy in Russia, because when you step back and you talk about broader European security architecture for the foreseeable future, the focus of European security architecture should be designed against Russia to deter Russian aggression and to defend against it if necessary. Later on, if there is a change in Russian policy and the Kremlin shows that it's prepared to live in peace with its neighbors, then perhaps you can talk about structures like the OSCE, where the idea was to include Russia. But for now, Russian actions have dictated that the security architecture needs to be oriented to defend against Russia.
Great, thank you all. And I would particularly like to thank you all for keeping your opening remarks to a short period of time. We have already achieved more than most think tank panels have. So I guess I'd like to start by directing a few individual questions at each of you. And I guess, Ben, let's just come back to you first. So I think a lot of people, particularly here in Washington and particularly in Eastern Europe, would argue that we've very much moved past the phase in which we should be considering, as Steve just put it, annoying Russia, right? That admitting Ukraine to NATO would be obviously an affront to the Kremlin, but really we don't care anymore, and that Ukraine has effectively earned its place in NATO by fighting this war. I mean, they're certainly more capable and doing more for defense than many of our European allies that are actually inside NATO. And so I'm just curious, how do you respond to that kind of comment, which seems very intuitively appealing?
I think it, with all due respect to Steve, it encapsulates a view of international relations, which I think is wrong, which is that we in the United States in particular are in the business of promoting justice, not security. It reminds me of the movie Unforgiven, where when Clint Eastwood is killing the Gene Hackman character. And the Gene Hackman character, Little Bill, says, I don't deserve this. And Clint Eastwood says, deserves got nothing to do with it. So in international relations, deserves got nothing to do with it. I mean, I sympathize with Ukraine. I think most reasonable people do. And I think that, that's why it makes sense for the United States to be helping Ukraine. But from where I'm sitting, and I think, the weight of the evidence suggests that offering security guarantees to Ukraine will increase the insecurity, certainly of the United States, which is most important to me as an American foreign policy analyst, but as I argued, also of Ukraine. And I think, what the other panelists didn't address is the fact that I don't think that the guarantees that the United States would make to Ukraine will be credible. I don't see why they'll be believed. I certainly don't believe them. I think they'll be fraudulent. And I think giving Ukraine more fraudulent promises is not going to remove it from the gray zone, as Lyanna said. It's going to leave it there, in fact, and it might create worse confusion and all sorts of bad things, as I explained. So I want to get it out of the gray zone, too, by saying, look, we're not going to play games with you anymore and pretend that you're going to be protected by the United States. We've proven that we're not going to protect you. And now we're going to say that. But what is credible is that we'll continue to arm you, and Ukraine has showed that it can hold Russia off. And I think that is creating a lot of deterrence, certainly for further Russian aggression.
Yeah, so Steve, I would like to sort of turn around and give you a chance to talk a little about that, to Ben's credibility point. If Ukraine is a vital interest for the United States, then why not fight now? And I guess just to add a little to that, it seems to me like we're sort of headed back into what Ben described a little earlier as the worst of all worlds, a very ambiguous situation in which Ukraine is promised NATO membership someday, but not now. And you know better than I from your long career that we've seen this story over and over when it comes to Ukraine, the Budapest Memorandum, the summit in Bucharest. Are we just headed back down the same road here with Ukraine?
Yeah, well, let me first, with respect, disagree with Ben. I go back to my first principle, which is the American interest in a stable and secure Europe. And I think this is about security. A secure Ukraine contributes to a stable and secure Europe. To the extent that Ukraine is not secure, you're going to see, I think, continued Russian aggression, continued Russian pressure on Ukraine, and it will continue to be a problem that will merit more attention, more resources, from the United States than we would like to otherwise provide. So again, I think the ultimate place is Ukraine and NATO. When that happens, I don't see that happening until there's an end to the conflict. But I guess I would disagree that, that these are fraudulent commitments. I think if NATO does take Ukraine in, Ukraine is covered by Article 5. There is every reason to defend Ukraine. Because the first time that NATO does not defend an ally, any ally, then immediately I think NATO has reached a point where it is no longer has any credibility. You can't distinguish between the credibility or your readiness to defend some allies and not others. I also would argue that a Ukraine in NATO, NATO also serves as a restraining influence, that a Ukraine in NATO is going to be more secure and is likely to do less things that could be provocative vis-a-vis Russia. So I do see real reasons and value to bringing Ukraine into the alliance. I would also argue, just on the justice point, and I will concede, at least in my case personally, I'm not divorcing my personal view in this. I helped negotiate Ukraine's denuclearization. I negotiated the Budapest Memorandum. And I will say that from an American perspective, Ukraine's decision to give up what was then the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, including almost 2,000 nuclear warheads designed, built, deployed to strike the United States, was largely influenced by the commitment they got from Russia at the time. Had the Russians not been prepared to make that commitment, we might well have had a very different outcome in terms of Ukraine's denuclearization. Now, the United States at the time, did make some commitments to Ukraine. We saw the Ukrainians were not prepared to go to war with Russia on their behalf, but we did make some commitments to be supportive here, and I think that does have an influence, at least on how I think of the problem.
Lyanna, let me come back to you here. So I was struck by your comment that Europe cannot be secure without Ukraine, that NATO cannot be secure without Ukraine. And I think even sort of putting aside the question that there have been plenty of periods in history where NATO's borders have not stretched nearly as far east in Europe, I guess I was wondering if I could push you a little on why does admitting Ukraine to NATO resolve sort of NATO's border problem, right? You say it's better for Poland to border a Ukraine that's inside NATO rather than an Israel-style model. But I'm curious why you don't just end up with exactly the same problem once you admit Ukraine to NATO. It seems to me this is one of the fundamental problems with NATO enlargement policy in recent years, is that there is no logical conclusion in some ways.
Yeah, I guess the argument would be that we have used the same kind of argument before 2008 and after 2008, that a NATO membership perspective for Ukraine would provoke Russia because it would violate Russian security interests. We've seen now that Russia has attacked Ukraine regardless of that, right? So our own assumptions about Russian interests and Russian security interests were proven wrong. And we would still repeat the same arguments to say that we've used before, to say, well, this is a step too far, and this would still sort of lead to this kind of insecurity that we might see. And the second point is, I don't entirely see, or I don't entirely agree that Russia would not take Ukraine in NATO seriously and would not respect Article 5. We have seen so far in the war that Russia has been very cautious in not getting into for Russian standards, cautious in terms of not getting into a conflict with NATO. They've clearly tried not to attack too close to Poland to prevent these kinds of incidents that we might have. So why should, after the end of the war, a NATO membership for Ukraine be tested by Russia if so far Russia has taken Article 5 seriously? And again, everyone thinks about the scenario in terms of now, in terms of an active war ongoing. But if the war ends and if the fighting stops, there is no reason why armed neutrality, which would mean constant warfare between Ukraine and Russia, constant risk of escalation, would be at this risk, would be safer than having Ukraine in NATO and having the deterrence of NATO work and prevent Russia from doing exactly that, and basically enforcing any kind of armistice or ceasefire that we might see at this point. So from this perspective, it just seems to me that as important as the Israel model is for now, as important as it is for the next years, it's not something that will last long enough to keep Europe secure. And it is not something which will help us to create a neighborhood which basically has been unfinished. I mean, this gray zone scenario will remain there if Ukraine does not become a NATO member. And I think we have to be careful if we say that it is really just about Ukraine's interest, or it is, about Ukraine having deserved this, because I think fundamentally, and especially if you look at it from a European perspective, it is really a question of Europe's security and not of security for sort of directly for the United States. And if we think about commitments to Ukraine, obviously from Russia's perspective, they will always look at US elections. They will always wait for the United States to reduce commitments that they've given to Ukraine before. So we would need a legal codification of Israel commitments, of Israel-style commitments, but at the same time, the future of Ukraine would be volatile to US domestic politics in a different way than Israel, which is less volatile to US domestic politics. And that is something which is obviously a risk to Europe and which is a risk to Ukraine.
Interesting. Yes, if you'll forgive me my own divergence a moment, my colleague Kelly Grieco and I at Stimson just actually wrote a paper on the Israel model for Ukraine. And one of the things that we ended up sort of discovering in our own research is that what we see today as the US-Israel relationship is not at all where it started. I think what the White House may be talking about is something closer to this relationship today with some sort of codified guarantees, whereas, as Ben mentioned earlier, there's also sort of an armed neutrality version of this. So, perhaps a little more clarity in what we mean when we say Israel model might also be helpful here. I do want to give our panelists just a moment if they want to respond to anything else that has been said by one of the other panelists thus far, and if not, I have a few other questions.
Yeah, I guess I would just briefly second Lyanna's point. I mean, if you are looking at sort of the armed neutrality as the permanent state for Ukraine, I do wonder if at the end of the day that does serve European security when you have the potential for further conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Whereas, if the war ends and then you bring Ukraine into NATO, I do think that actually has an impact on calculations in Moscow, that Moscow would recognize that a conventional war against Ukraine was really hard. A conventional war against a Ukraine backed up by the conventional forces of NATO, it'd be impossibly hard. It does provide, I think, the degree of security. And again, Moscow doesn't like it or would not like it. But I think Moscow's concern that they've moved beyond that by virtue of Russian actions over the past 16 months.
Ben, do you want to respond here?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I'd like to respond to, and many of them have slipped away from me mentally. But first of all, the armed neutrality doesn't assume that there's going to be a war. It's a way to create a credible, unlike, say, we're just going to give Ukraine a security guarantee that's unbelievable, give them a credible way to help them deter Russia. And I think so that is as much a path to peace as anything. Look, we cannot escape, I think, the very controversial topic of the cause of the war. I just fundamentally disagree with what Lyanna said about we've learned that this had nothing to do with NATO expansion. Absolutely not. This war was predicted. It was predictable, and it was predicted by people like George Kennan. And I think there's a false dichotomy that goes on where people say, well, it was imperialism, so it can't have anything to do with NATO. And as a paper that we're getting set to publish at Defense Priorities will argue, the whole argument was with the people who said, like Bill Burns, this is the brightest of red lines, that the whole argument was that we're going to juice Russian imperialism and the worst aggressive instincts that Russia has by shoving NATO up to their border. So imperialism, in fact, is in service of the argument that we shouldn't expand NATO, not the alternative. So I think if we say we're putting Ukraine in NATO, when the war ends, you've just handed Russia a huge incentive not to let the war end. I think that's probably the worst thing we could do. If we put them in NATO now, or just give them security guarantees now, we're immediately faced with the prospect of we have an immediate nuclear crisis. I mean, let's not forget, NATO is about nuclear weapons. The extension of U.S. deterrence is a fancy way of saying we threaten to nuke Russians on your behalf. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about threatening mass destruction against Russia on behalf of Ukraine. And to do that, you have to be able to say, that we're willing to trade New York for Kyiv or whatever it is, for Moscow. So, that people used to take that seriously. Like, how do you make that threat? How do you make a threat to commit suicide on behalf of West Germany when you just got done fighting a war against them in World War II? Arms and Influence by Tom Schelling is all about that question. How do you make this credible? And he talks about, the threat that leaves something to chance and all these things. And now everybody just says, oh, you snap your fingers. We signed a piece of paper. So who would not believe that we're going to fight for Ukraine, even though we just got done refusing to fight for them and risking nuclear weapons? So I think at a minimum, we have to start taking the credibility of these threats seriously. And I think that would mean we have to do all this planning around how we're going to defend the 1,200 mile border that Ukraine has with Russia. And we're going to talk about putting tripwire forces in there and really get close to fighting World War III. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. We want to threaten World War III on behalf of Ukraine. And anyway, so I'm talking too much, but I just think the U.S. has no interest in doing that, and we can't change that just by snapping our fingers and holding up a piece of paper and say, see, look, we promise.
Perhaps
I guess
the counter arguments to that, if I may, just to come in. I mean, I think the 2 points that you mentioned about sort of, is it about NATO or not? I mean, for those that have closely observed Russia in the years running up to the Ukraine war and sort of Russian domestic politics, I don't think this really holds up to say the primary driver was NATO and sort of imperialism is just a function of that driver. Because what we've seen in Russian politics is that, and we have to allow Russia to have some agency in that too. I mean, it's not only sort of Western politics driving Russia into the place where it is. What we've seen in Russian politics is a kind of, up and down over the years during Putin's term, during President Medvedev's term, where NATO was not always the focus and where the myth surrounding NATO as a threat to Russian security was also intentionally built up by the Russian leadership. The leadership is a kind of substitute part of the ideology that they've been putting together over the years. And I think the most interesting aspect to that is really that in the run-up to the war and in the year that preceded the war, I mean, there was really no sign that Ukraine was moving to NATO any closer. So the primary driver that we can at least identify from now is an ideological radicalization of Vladimir Putin himself. And that is scary enough. I mean, that's scary enough that one leader throughout the pandemic can radicalize himself so much that he believes in his place of history, that he believes that Ukraine has to be taken back. And if one reads his tweet, his long article about historical unity with Ukraine, it is not largely about Ukraine. It is largely about his vision for Russia, for his vision of Greater Russia. So I don't think that is something which really helps us to argue that a NATO membership is a mistake that we've done once. And if we argue that it's not in the US interest or not in the alliance interest to welcome Ukraine because it would be a suicide mission or World War III, I mean, the same arguments were made with regard to Poland, with regard to the Baltic states, right? I mean, we had the same arguments, who would die for Vilnius? I mean, who would die for Warsaw? But we've seen that these kinds of measures are the only ones which eventually have helped to stabilize and have helped to calm down Europe. And that is a fundamental US interest, because if Europe is not stable and calm, the United States, as in past history, will always be drawn back to Europe to solve the problem. They just can't sort of leave Europe to their mess. And I'm afraid that even for the United States, apart from the fact that NATO membership is less costly than arming Ukraine for decades, that the United States, without a clear end to the security question in Europe, will always be drawn back to probably hot conflict, because Russian leaders will not accept that it will, one can argue it will be an incentive for Putin to not stop fighting. He might already think that he should not stop fighting. And the other way around to see that is that Ukraine not in NATO would be an incentive for all Russian leaders after him to try again. And I think that is something which in the long-term perspective should be something we should consider, not only for the next 5 years, for the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, if I
go into detail with NATO enlargement, but I just wanted to present the counter arguments to that.
Yeah, if I could add a couple of points. One is
quickly.
I mean, NATO deterrence defense fundamentally at the end of the day depends on nuclear weapons. However, the concerns about risking Chicago for Bonn, that was voiced in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when NATO was or perceived itself to be at a significant conventional disadvantage vis-a-vis the Soviet and the Warsaw Pact. A Ukraine in NATO now could handily defeat Russia at the conventional level. Now, so you don't have, I think, the sort of concern that you're talking about, Ben, which I think was really during the height of the Cold War. But I would also like to just, again, I think this notion that NATO enlargement was responsible for this war just does not stand up to scrutiny. 2002, in May of 2002, Vladimir Putin goes to Rome. He agrees with NATO to deepen and give a new character to NATO-Russia relations, and he does that knowing full well that NATO allies are going to meet 5 months later in Prague, and they are likely to invite, or they're going to invite additional countries to join, quite likely including the Baltic states. He makes no fuss about enlargement, even though that decision will take the number of NATO countries that border Russian territory from 2, Norway and Poland, to 3, to 5, adding Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. For most up until 2022, I think it was very clear that Russia or that Ukraine had no near immediate-term prospect of NATO membership, and that had to be known to Russian diplomats and Russian intelligence agents. There was just no move within NATO to put Ukraine on the membership track. I think the irony here is that it's been the Russian war that seems to have energized this idea within NATO. Finally, just look at Putin's reaction last May when Finland and Sweden announced that they were seeking membership. It was basically a shrug. Finland's entry into NATO basically doubled the border between NATO and Russia and put a NATO member quite close to a lot of Russian military facilities that we thought were quite sensitive on the Kola Peninsula. That was no big deal. I just don't think the history bears out this argument that this war was about NATO enlargement. It was about domestic reasons, and I think, unfortunately, Vladimir Putin's idea of establishing a legacy of recovering of what he calls historic Russian lands.
So I think we're sort of off on a little bit of a tangent here, and I may redirect us, but I would just like to recommend for anyone interested in learning more about this issue, an excellent recent edited volume by Josh Shifrinson and Jim Goldgeier called Evaluating NATO Enlargement, which brings together perspectives from folks who believe that NATO enlargement was instrumental in the current war and in the previous war in Ukraine and in Georgia, and those who believe the opposite, that this was fairly much inevitable. So I think that's an excellent mix of perspectives. But to redirect us back to our topic of security guarantees for Ukraine today, it seems to me quite notable that we all pretty much agree that NATO membership for Ukraine isn't happening now, isn't happening soon, and may or may not happen at some point in the future. The question that I always end up with here is, why do policymakers in Washington and European capitals, why are policymakers still so fixated on the NATO option rather than looking for other sort of more practical solutions, ways to approximate security guarantees, ways to encourage Ukraine to arm itself? It seems that we continue to get very much wrapped around the axle of, will we expand NATO or not, when we've kind of moved into a period where we've really passed the debates about will NATO expand further, and now we're talking about how NATO handles the states that border it in order to better secure its security. And I'll just open this up to anybody that would like to address it.
Perhaps one point, also following the European debate, which is perhaps a little bit less focused on the NATO question right now, I wouldn't actually say that we are sort of overlooking the other options. That's not what I see. I do think, perhaps that's the public discussion, right? With op-eds appearing in the New York Times and Washington Post against or for NATO membership. But I do think in practical policy making, what policymakers are doing right now is setting Ukraine on track for this kind of security commitments that we are talking about right now. So we did see Poland, France, and Germany coordinating on what kind of security commitments can we give to Ukraine. And this is basically what will be offered to Ukraine at the Vilnius summit, not only a Ukraine NATO council instead of a NATO-Ukraine commission, but some kind of commitments by European states, by the United States for long-term armament. So I don't think it's really out out of sight. I do feel it's rather something that policymakers are working on, and that is something which is important, but which is sort of the minimum that we should achieve in principle. I mean, this is something which is obvious, that we can't just continue as we do right now, with Rammstein meetings of the defense ministers taking place every 2 months. We need more formalized structures. We need more long-term commitments in there, just to future-proof the whole project. And that is going on. But at the same time, the question is are there some points where we can push the envelope further, as I've said before? And I think that's probably why it is so captivating to the public debate, because it's really about what is the finality of European security, and what is the final response to Russia's war, not only for the next 5 years, but really for the next 10, 15, or 20 years.
Yeah, and I would give you 2 brief answers to your question. First, it seems to me that the focus on NATO is driven by conclusions by a number of allies and the other answers do not suffice, that they don't solve the problem. And I think the second point is you now have, and I think it's emerged really since the Russian invasion in February of 2022, you now have a group of allies, which may now include about half of the members of NATO, who are coming out and saying, yes, we should put Ukraine on track to membership, in a way that they weren't saying that back prior to February of 2022. So I think those are the 2 reasons that explain why NATO has now been so much the focus of discussion.
And surprisingly, France joining those suddenly, you say, joining or not. I mean, I think it's still out in the open, but it's an interesting change.
I'm not sure whether France is exactly where President Macron was in those comments. I would not yet put him in that group of countries that are really on board with enlargement, but we'll see.
Yeah, France, perhaps the biggest shift on NATO in the last few years, from brain dead back to expansion. So I guess, one question that I want to talk about, or to play devil's advocate a little, is we talk about whether it's NATO expansion, whether it's concrete security guarantees, that these are a way to sort of prevent Russia from being able to outlast the West, to not just have Moscow wait for the West to tire of the war in Ukraine and move forward. But it seems to me, again, if I was going to play devil's advocate here, that the West is getting tired, that there is falling public support for Ukraine, that political will is, if not dropping off among elites, then it will probably drop off in a few years. And this isn't just US electoral politics, that this is seen in variety of NATO member states. And so I guess I'm just, again, curious about your thoughts about how sustainable some kind of security guarantee to Ukraine would be going forward. Is this something that would allow leaders to maintain a relatively consistent policy towards Ukraine, or is this something where we're likely to see big shifts? And Ben, since you're back with us, perhaps I could offer you the first shot at this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it. Again, I guess I sound like a bit like a broken clock here, but it doesn't matter if we offer them a security guarantee if another administration comes in and says we're not doing that. So it creates some greater chance that they'll stick with it. But you can't just obviate U.S. interests by saying that you've done something permanent, and you got to go to the U.S. Senate to get a treaty. That at least creates a more credible commitment. So if the United States just signs some agreement and says, we're going to guarantee their security and give them some arms, it could go away tomorrow. So, Lyanna, you said that's going to be a problem, and nothing you propose, and I agree, but nothing you propose would fix it. It's an inescapable aspect of U.S. politics that, if we change our mind, we're not going to do it.
Would either of you like to respond or add to that?
That's a scary last sentence, Ben. If you change your mind, we're not going to do it for all of Europe and for all of NATO. I mean, sort of commenting on public opinion, I would say that I'm rather surprised how long support for Ukraine is holding up already. I mean, that's something which I didn't expect at all at the outbreak of the war. And given the recent pollings that we had from the United States, that it's still, going down, but still fairly stable. In Europe, we also still have fairly stable polling numbers. it is actually surprising to me, and I think the only explanation that I can give is that I really do think that Russia's actions in Ukraine keep this war on the radar of many people. So, I mean, the dam, the discussion now about the nuclear power. I mean, Russia is the best guarantee for the Western publics not become tired so far, right? I mean, what happened in Russia domestically, the instability that we might see in Russia in the next years, it is something which dominates the news. It is something which keeps coming back. And it is something which, in contrast to past crises, is a real security threat to Europe. And I mean, of course, Poland and Central and Eastern European countries feel closer to that security threat than Germany and France, but it is also a security threat for the whole of Europe. And that's why I believe it's going to be here to stay. But obviously, I mean, thinking 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead, there is this concern. That is why these kind of commitments, I mean, it's the same argument for a guarantee, a NATO-like guarantee, and for commitments that we make for Ukraine. If we promise Ukraine now, the better alternative for you is an Israel model, or today's Israel model, if sort of, as you said, Emma, it has changed over the years. And in 2 years, that is not the case anymore, then this is a relatively weak support for Ukraine, which is why this kind of legal codification would be so important, if possible at all.
But I mean, you think we're going to fight World War III for them, and you're worried about public opinion just for giving them a few $1 billion. Like, I don't see how those things go together. You know, let me just say, I think as much as people just assert that Ukraine has some important effects on. So Europe is not a single entity, right? They're working on it, but there's some work yet to do. And Poland's one thing, right? But even Germany is another. And there's a reason why Germany didn't follow through on its pledges to spend all this extra money on defense, right? They noticed that I think that Russia had run aground in Ukraine, and that the United States was rushing all these troops into Europe. So they didn't do it. They didn't do what they said they were going to do, and they're not gonna, because the threat is not there. So I very much disagree. I think that, as much as elites say, oh yeah, this is a terrible security threat to us, they reveal a preference that they don't think that's true. And the revealed preference is the right one. What we're doing for Ukraine is a charity project, and I think it's a worthy one. But saying over and over again that it's a security thing that is vital to U.S. security doesn't make it so. And I tried to explain why it isn't. I don't see how you get to a strong security argument for the United States. And if you were right about that, it would be much easier to get the United States to take more risks for Ukraine. So I think it's just assertion without a lot of basis.
No, I think it's a misinterpretation of the situation of Europe. I mean, it's not true that Germany has stopped spending the money because they suddenly felt that Russia is not enough of a threat. That's not true. I mean, we will have Germany reaching 2% in the next 2 years.
Well, they're not going to admit that, but that seems to be what happened.
No, I mean, that's not, I mean, just saying that's not what's happening. So what's happening is actually that the money that Germany is planning to spend takes more time to spend. But we will see Germany from 2024 to 2026 reaching 2%. So that's going to happen. The question is what happens afterwards. The commitment is there. We've just seen an announcement from the German side to permanently deploy a brigade in Lithuania. We see the same kind of outreach from France to the Central and Eastern Europeans. So that sort of the threat perception in Europe is just not true. I mean, the threat perception might not be as acute as the moment when we thought, Russia is going to take Kiev, but it's definitely not gone. And in the same way as US is still a NATO member, a security threat perception in Europe is also of interest for the United States.
Yeah, and I just said, Ben, briefly to your point, I mean, yes, a future administration could change American policy. It could change its mind. But I think it would be a lot easier for a future administration to change its mind on providing arms to Ukraine than it would be on supporting Ukraine if Ukraine was a member of NATO. Because again, that decision not to support an ally who was attacked directly would basically be the end of NATO.
Oh, I meant to disagree with before, if I might. So I recommend the book Calculating Credibility by Darryl Press that talks about where credibility comes from. I talk about this in my paper. I don't think that there's much support for the idea that it just comes from signing up for an alliance. I think it comes from interest and capability. So I think that anyone paying attention, including Russia, would look and say the United States has a pretty strong interest in defending Germany and France, and it doesn't have much of an interest in defending Ukraine. And so we're not going to just have this domino theory. Poland's a little bit of a middle case, but I mean, okay, not all
I
domino
know.
theories are wrong. It's a domino theory.
You are nervous
It's a set
again.
of
So
sorry?
let me I guess interject here, because we're starting to run out of time, as much fun as this is, and I have two remaining questions, so let's try and do this quickly. Lyanna, let me just address the first one to you, since I think you're probably best placed to answer it. We've spent this entire time talking about NATO or about some other kind of security guarantees, but what about the European Union? It seems in many ways like if you wanted to build ties between Western Europe and Central Europe and Ukraine, that you'd want to build up those economic ties. But it seems like that's even more contentious in European capitals in some ways than NATO membership is. And I wonder why that's the case. The cynic in me wonders if that is something that is relatively more costly, admitting Ukraine to the EU in some sort of way, than providing a security guarantee on paper.
Yeah, I would actually agree. I think in terms of bureaucratic procedures and regulations and all kinds of compromises that have to be found, EU membership is more complicated than NATO membership, because a whole legal acquis, as in Brussels speak they would call it, the whole regulations and so on, has to be adopted. And for Europe it is so difficult, and that's why this commitment to EU membership for Ukraine is so remarkable, because the European Union will have to do reform itself. I mean, otherwise, for instance, all the money that goes to countries that have a large agricultural base, especially France, will have to go to Ukraine. I mean, just the whole system will have to be restructured to take in a country of 40 million and of the size and of economic power of Ukraine. But I don't see signs yet that the European Union is not taking it seriously. I mean, the discussions are beginning, and it's going to be a long process. And the main question is, will we see Ukraine accession steps in parallel with the EU reform process? Because that's even more complicated than Ukraine's reform process. Or will we see it sort of afterwards? And my suggestion would always be to do this in parallel, because then we might, just advance faster than waiting until the EU has reformed itself. It might need some treaty change, which is incredibly difficult, and then accepting Ukraine. But I do think, that's something which is on track. And I do think, however, that the EU is really no alternative for Ukraine in terms of a security haven, a security provider. I mean, there are some ideas that in the end, Article 42.7 of the European Union is also something of a mutual defense clause, and that if the European Union takes security and defense more seriously, Ukraine can sort of be protected by EU membership. That's something which I fundamentally don't believe. I think it's something which at some point in the development of the European Union, we might see, 40 years down the line, but we are not there yet. And so it would always be a concealed NATO promise, because there's so many EU members that are also NATO members, which would create a weird ambiguity. And already now many neutral members of the European Union are concerned about making sure that Ukraine's membership will not lead to any security commitments from their side. And I think the strongest argument is Finland and Sweden were EU members, and that was not enough for them, right? I mean, NATO is still different than the EU is, obviously, and it is still the crucial second element that is needed, EU and NATO enlargement together.
So we unfortunately only have a couple of minutes left. I do want to offer Ben and Steve both an opportunity to say a few final words here if you would like. My remaining question, which I don't know if we will have time to actually address here, is whether security guarantees should be linked to war termination in Ukraine or not. But Ben, Steve, if there's anything you would like to add or address as we wrap up here, you have about 30 seconds each.
Did you say I could go first?
Sure.
Okay.
As I said before, I think that if you say in advance that you're going to put them in NATO as part of a peace process, that you're telegraphing that you're going to do that, you de-incentivize Russia from ending the war. So I think that's a very bad idea. I guess the other thing I'll just say to wrap up is that I think, look, the way we interpret history matters a lot. I think it's mythology that NATO the prospect of NATO coming into Ukraine, which is different than Sweden, which is different than Finland, which is the brightest of red lines for Russia, we were told repeatedly, that prospect made Russia worried that Ukraine was going to be taken away from them. And they said, we're going to take it first. And that doesn't make Russia innocent. It doesn't mean they had legitimate security concerns, but it means that offering Ukraine security guarantees now, rather than extinguishing the cause of the war, might keep it aflame. So I think we have to take these questions of history very seriously, because these differing interpretations of what caused the war could lead to, in my estimation, severe danger for the United States and even for Ukraine.
Yeah, again, I just read history very differently than Ben does. I think at key points by Putin's own statements, by Russian actions, they've shown that NATO was not the cause of this war. I would also note this, one of the ironies here. Go back to 2013. In 2013, Russia had a Ukrainian president who did not want a membership action plan, was not interested in bringing this country to NATO. The Ukrainian population polls showed maybe 15 to 20% wanted to see the country in NATO. It was the European Union. And up until about 2010, Russia had said that it had no problem with Ukraine's relationship with the European Union. In 2013, in the summer, they decided that they had a big problem with that. Remember, what triggered the Maidan Revolution was Yanukovych's decision not to sign an association agreement with the European Union. Why didn't he do that? Because of pressure from Moscow. We're in this situation because Moscow was unprepared to accept an association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. NATO wasn't on the field at the time. That's where we got ourselves to this position.
Well, thank you to you all, and thanks to everybody at home for joining us. Clearly, there is both a very tangled web of history to sort through in Ukraine's relations with the West and Russia, and also a lot of questions about how to move forward in those relationships. So everybody here has written pretty widely on this topic. I encourage you to check out their articles and to give us a round of applause for our lovely panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma.
Thanks very much.
All right.